Hi viewers, I take pride and pleasure in introducing to you the topic research process. In fact, before I move on to the details, let me read out the learning outcomes of what are expected of you after getting to know the contents of this module. First learning outcome is to explain the characteristic features of research in social sciences. The second expected outcome is to spell out the key concepts in the process of social research with clear elucidation. And finally, the learning outcome is to apply the basic principles of research process for your particular research investigation. With these three learning outcomes, let me move on to the topic as such. Well, when we look at the title given for this module, there are two words. The first word is research and the other word is process. Let us see what we mean by research. In fact, we can split the word research into two components. The first component is re and the second component is search. So, re plus search is equal to research. What do we mean by search? Search means examination, or to search, I mean to examine or explore. Many of us know that the prefix re is used for the meaning again. So, research is to examine any phenomenon again and again across various situations or contexts or conditions. That is what research is all about. Mind you, it's a profession by itself. Therefore, it's a process. And though there is no hard and fast rule that this is how research has to be done, still we have certain procedures in place. So, process as such would mean step-by-step venture. It's a task where we need to be very systematic in investigating the factors that operate on any given phenomenon. Well, when we look at the academic world, there are two main aspects which go covered in the academic world. One of them is the art stream and the other one is science stream. Coming to social science, well, it has one foot on either side. It is a scientific domain, but at the same time, the target is always society of human beings. Therefore, we need to be scientific, but at the same time, the principles of science will have to be used in understanding various aspects of human beings. That is what social science research is all about. Research, any Tom, Dick and Harry can do, but it's a scientific process. Therefore, it is distinctly different from common sense. Though it may appear that we begin with common sense, perhaps it is correct, but at the same time, we differ significantly from the common sense point of view. That by which I mean there are certain differences between science and common sense approaches. Science believes in theoretical or conceptual structures which are systematically built based on a thorough investigation, whereas in common sense, everything is speculated in a loose manner, and that too in a selective way, perhaps to suit one's whims and fancies. In other words, we can say layman builds castle in the air, whereas a person who is scientific carefully builds one's concepts in a very sound and systematic theoretical framework. The second difference between these two approaches is that in science, we apply the principles of control so that we can effectively rule out the influence of extraneous forces, whereas in common sense, we never bother about the importance of control. The third difference between the two is that in science, the relationship among concepts or variables in any given phenomenon is well knit, whereas in common sense, absolutely no care is taken whatsoever for linking the concepts which are there in the phenomenon. Finally, science safely, with inverted commas, distances itself from all metaphysical explanations because they are beyond the scope of empirical verification, whereas common sense very much ventures into metaphysical elucidation, no matter how epistemologically sound it is. These four are the main differences between common sense and science, and let us move on to the ultimate aim of science. The ultimate aim of science is theory building. What is a theory? Theory is a set of interrelated constructs or concepts, definitions and propositions that present a systematic view of phenomenon by specifying the relationship among variables with the purpose of explaining and predicting the phenomenon. Therefore, there are four aims in theory building. The first aim is explanation, second aim is control, the third aim is generalizability, fourth and the last is prediction. I would like to now move on to 5 specific features of science. What are they? Number 1, science has to be objective. Therefore, objectivity is very much insisted upon. Second feature, it has to be precise. Precision is yet another hallmark of science. The third one, we need to repeat certain things, certain investigations over a period of time so that we are sure of the consistency of results. Therefore, repeatability is the third feature of science. As we go on repeating, we can generalize our findings to the entire human population after some period of time. Therefore, generalizability becomes the fourth feature of science. Fifth and the last is predictability. Generally, we apply the principle of probability. Based on probability theory, we go about predicting the phenomenon. Now, we will narrow our discussion to the 2 broad types of research in social sciences, namely empirical and rational. Empirical type is based on facts which are converted into figures. Predominantly, the approach is quantitative, while rational approach is also followed in social sciences. Their theories are built on objectively linking various aspects using mainly qualitative methodology. I can very well give an example, and psychoanalysis, especially Freud and others, did not seem to have followed empirical procedure. On the other hand, their approach was rational, yet it is acceptable. Well, the present scope of this module is to throw light on empirical research process in brief. How do we begin our empirical research? First step is to do a thorough review of literature. Based on the review of literature, we identify the research problem for the investigation. That happens to be the second step. From the second step, as we move on to the next one, we formulate hypothesis. From there, we move on to research design. Then, based on research design, we go about sampling procedure so that we can collect data based on the design that we have on hand. From there, we move on to data analysis. Finally, it is research report writing that marks the end of any empirical research process. Of course, it is cyclical in nature. because review of literature very much depends upon the report that is submitted with regard to the previous research studies. So it is cyclical. Now let me explain to you some of the key concepts which we need to know as we carry on with our empirical research study. The first concept that I'd like to define and to an extent explain is the concept of variable. What do we mean by variable? Anything that differs in kind or degree is what we call variable. Variables can be classified into so many categories. One of the ways by which we classify variables is in terms of independent versus dependent. By independent variable, we mean the factors which cause any particular phenomenon, whereas dependent happens to be the effect of that cause. In the language of psychology, independent variables are called stimulus variables. These stimuli either can come from the external world or from the internal world. When they are from the internal world, we may call them organismic variable because so many stimuli are there inside the organism and the response can be due to the stimuli which operate from within. But generally speaking, it is the interaction that takes place between the external environment and the internal environment. From there, dependent variable emerges. And independent variables, by and large, are actively manipulable, or sometimes they can be attributes of any given individual. Whenever independent variables take the form of attribute variables, they are mainly organismic in nature. Well, this is one way by which we classify variables. Another way by which we can classify variables is in terms of discrete versus continuous. Anything which is discontinuous or categorical is what we call discrete variable. On the other hand, continuous is just an opposite of discrete, and it is sort of a free flow that will mark the nature of any variable. I can very well give one or two examples to explain the difference. I said earlier, discrete variables are qualitative in nature. Discrete variables are attribute variables. They go with the organism. One stock example I can give you, well-known example I can give you is gender. We classify people in terms of gender either as males or females, but nowadays we have third gender also is included as an integral part of the population. So they are all the manifestations of that discrete variable called gender. On the other hand, well-known example for continuous variable is age, because it is sort of a continuum that we see in the age of any given individual. It can be an 1-year-old child or children of 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, like that. The age can go up to any number of years. It is continuous. Therefore, by nature, age is a continuous variable. Having said this, it can also be converted into a discrete variable, because sometimes in the research design, we have that flexibility of converting any continuous variable into discrete. Generally, what we do is we work out the median. Those who fall above the median will be called the older group, whereas those who fall below the median will be called the younger group. Therefore, age, though by nature is a continuous variable, can be converted into a discrete variable as the younger versus older groups of people. Now, let me move on to the research problem. What do we mean by research problem? It's an interrogative statement on the relationship of two or more variables chosen for the study. One example I can give you for explaining the concept of research problem. It is an interrogative statement. The word interrogation would automatically mean it's a question, but question in the form of a statement. It may look like an oxymoron, but when you look at the example that I am giving you, the research problem is to investigate whether variable x, in this context reward, will be related to speed of learning, which is called variable y of primary school children. So when you look into this research statement, research problem statement, one question becomes fairly visible. Is variable x related to variable y? That is the question that is raised in this problem, but it has been stated in the form of a statement. Well, what is the basis by which we identify the research problem? As I said earlier, it is an extension of the review of secondary data. By review, we mean critical analysis. It is just not cataloging of studies, but it is critical analysis of the previous research studies. As you critically analyze, definitely sometimes gaps will be found between the findings, and such gaps can be taken as the potential source for identifying a research problem. Sometimes gaps may not be there, but contradictions in the results will be there. Contradictions between the results obtained by investigator A and the investigator B. Then it becomes important for the third researcher to know whether A's findings are right or B's findings are right. In such a scenario, the issue becomes a research problem. Well, there are two important criteria of a problem in empirical research. The first criterion is that there must be minimum two variables, maximum can be any number. Therefore, when you look at any research problem, minimum two variables must be there, maximum any number, two or more variables should be there in any given research problem. Second criterion is that you should state it in such a way that quantification becomes possible, because it is empirical research process. Well, from there we move on to the hypothesis. Please look at the spelling of hypothesis. Though it may appear very trivial, but it is a very fundamental aspect. Whenever you have only one hypothesis, the spelling, the last two alphabets in the spelling are IS. Whereas when you are going to have more than one hypothesis, the plural will have ES as the last two letters of the word. Well, having told you what the singular form and the plural form of hypothesis, let me now tell you what we mean by hypothesis. It's a conjectural statement on the relationship of two or more variables in the study. Just only one word will make hypothesis and problem differ from each other. If problem is an interrogative statement, hypothesis is a conjectural statement. By conjecture, we mean assume. It's based on assumption. Therefore, hypothesis is sort of an assumption where you state the relationship of two or more variables which are there in the study. And of course, you need to state hypothesis in such a way that quantification is possible with respect to the variables of the study. There are many types of hypothesis. We broadly classify them into two categories, namely null versus alternate hypothesis. What do we mean by null? Null means nullification. That means there is no difference, there is no significant difference between any two conditions with regard to any variable. Or if you are going to be variable oriented in your hypothesis testing, the null hypothesis will definitely have the word not. X will not be significantly related to variable y. Variable x will not be significantly related to variable y. I underline the word not because that is what would make you understand the form of hypothesis that is there in the report is null in nature. The Other hypothesis is called alternate hypothesis, and this alternate hypothesis again is of two types. One of them will indicate the direction and the other one will not indicate the direction. Therefore, it is non-directional alternate hypothesis and directional alternate hypothesis. They are alternate to the null hypothesis, and generally we symbolically represent null hypothesis with capital H and 0 as its subscript, whereas for alternate hypothesis we use the Greek alphabet delta in capital. It is something like equilateral triangle, whereas delta subscript 1 is for non-directional hypothesis, delta subscript 2 is for directional. Why should we have this many types of hypothesis? Null hypothesis is generally formulated for exploratory study, whereas non-directional hypothesis is for confirmatory study, directional hypothesis is for replicatory study. For want of time, I am not able to explain to you the differences among these three types of studies. I assume that they are self-explanatory. From hypothesis, we move on to the stage of research design. Research design is the plan, structure and strategy of investigation conceived so as to obtain answers to research questions and to control variance. When you look at the definition of research design, there are two aspects. The first aspect is about the structural aspect. The second aspect is the functional aspect. There are two purposes which serve as function of the research design. The first purpose is to provide an answer to the question that is raised in the research problem, and the second purpose is to control variance. I want you to go back to the differences that I told you between common sense and scientific research. In scientific research, we very much bother about the principle of control. So, research design is conceived for two reasons. The first reason is to obtain answer to the research question. Second reason is to control variance. In fact, we have sort of a dictum called max, min, con principle. In fact, they are contractions of the word maximization, minimization and control. Max means maximize systematic variance, min means minimize error variance, con means control extraneous variance. Systematic variance is true in nature because it is predictable, which is what we are supposed to maximize while conceiving a research design. As we maximize the systematic variance, which is true in nature, the other variance called error variance, which is unpredictable, that has to be minimized. And the third type of variance, which can be an integral part of error variance if it is not identified and controlled adequately. In case it is identified and controlled adequately, it will contribute to true variance, and that is what we call extraneous variance. In fact, there are 5 methods by which we can control the extraneous variables. The first method is randomization. Second method is matching. Third method, you eliminate that variable as a variable. Fourth one, you can very well build it into the research design and study its impact along with the main independent variable. The fifth and the last, well, we always have statistics coming to our rescue after collecting data on any set of variables. Statistically, you can control or keep the extraneous variance away from the error variance. In fact, research designs are of so many types, but for the present module, I'd like to look at research designs in 3 different ways. The first way is cross-sectional versus longitudinal. Second way by which we can categorize research designs will be in terms of ex post facto versus experimental. Third and the last, univariate versus multivariate. What do we mean by cross-sectional design? Cross-sectional design, well, only once we will collect data from the sample, not repeatedly, but it has to be representative of the population from where the sample is drawn. Whereas longitudinal, repeatedly over a period of time, you go to the same sample, collect data again and again, and that sort of design is called longitudinal. In ex post facto research study, either the independent variable is inherently not manipulable, or even if it is manipulable, the experimenter does not manipulate. All that the experimenter does is to study the relationship between independent variable, which we call x variable, and the dependent variable, which we call y variable. So, based on the concomitant relationship that exists between x and y, we go about doing ex post facto research. Whereas in experimental research, independent variable is actively manipulated. When we say manipulation, it is definitely not a word meaning something not professional. Professionally, you systematically keep varying the manifestation of the independent variable. Independent variable will be under your control. Either you withhold or you present, and when you withhold, what impact it produces on the dependent variable, or when you allow it to present itself, what impact it will have on the dependent variable is what we mean by experimental research design. Univariate research design would mean one variable on the side of independent and dependent variables, then it becomes univariate. But our experience in the field of research reveals for any single phenomenon, umpteen number of variables are in operation. Therefore, we need to study all the variables which are operating on any phenomenon. Therefore, we go for multivariate research design of late in social science too. The ideal combination, in fact, there are so many combinations and permutations which one can arrive at based on these three classifications. But ideally speaking, sound research design should be experimental, longitudinal, and multivariate in nature. I repeat, longitudinal, experimental, multivariate research design will always be superior to cross-sectional, ex post facto, and univariate research design. From here, we move on to sampling. Sampling is a procedure of selecting any part or segment of a population or universe as representative of that population or universe. Broadly, there are two methods, namely probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Details, I think, will be given separately, and these are the methods: observation, interview, standardized tests or batteries of tests, inventories, questionnaires, checklists, and so many more methods are there in social science research. From data collection, we move on to data analysis, and data analysis either will be quantitative in nature or qualitative in nature, but they are complementary. And I always feel that quantitative analysis should always be followed by qualitative analysis to do full justice to the data which are collected. Well, in quantitative analysis, we use statistics, and statistics are of three types. One is non-parametric, the other one is parametric, and finally multivariate statistics. And from data analysis, we move on to report writing, and in fact, report can be in the form of a thesis or dissertation, and it can be in the form of several research articles which can be published in any peer-reviewed journals. Well, whatever findings that you are not able to report, or if they are already reported in any peer-reviewed journals, even the general population should know what exactly you have done in your research career. So, popular articles should also come out of our desk based on our research work, so that it reaches the mass. For further reading, these are the books I recommend. Well, with this note, I'd like to conclude: unreported research is as bad as not doing research. Therefore, every researcher will have to convey or communicate whatever one does in the research world to the rest of the world. Thank you.